The great expanse of the American West. A land of many frontiers and once the arena of one of the greatest battles in scientific history. The story of the West is one of ambition, expansion, and bloodshed. Men and women lived and died on the frontier in search of gold, glory, and a new place to call home, often clashing with those who had already been living in these lands for thousands of years. But beneath the feet of those vying for control over this new world lies an ancient legacy millions of years older. Across the sea in the Old World, scientists had been making remarkable discoveries of animals like none ever seen before. Massive reptiles that had apparently once roamed the earth from the land to the seas and the skies. The most famous among them coming to be known as the dinosaurs. And soon these discoveries would not be limited to the confines of Europe, for this newly christened field of paleontology would make its way to American soil. In the midst of this scientific gilded age would rise two inspiring scientists, both with the ambition and the will to make their mark on history. However, these two paleontologists, once trusted colleagues, would see their relentless ambition clash in one of the greatest rivalries of all time. This was the story of America's greatest dinosaur hunters. This was the Bone Wars. On July 14, 1803, a treaty arrived in Washington, D.C. It heralded the beginnings of the single largest territorial expansion in the entire history of the United States, that being the Louisiana Purchase. At nearly 830,000 square miles of uncharted wilderness, this land, once belonging to the newly formed First French Republic, would be sold to the United States by the soon-to-be conqueror of Europe and emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, at the time First Consul of the Republic of France, an acquisition that had been a long-term goal for founding father and third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, along with future President James Monroe and Robert R. Livingston, were heavily involved in negotiations with Napoleon to acquire said land. Jefferson in particular wanted to purchase the land in order to gain control of the Mississippi River and the New Orleans port, and through discussion with French Treasury Minister Francois Mabois, it seemed at first that the purchased land would be that of the city of New Orleans. That was until a quick agreement was reached by the representatives of both sides to purchase the entire territory of Louisiana. This was made possible by the war in Europe, as Napoleon had feared that either the British or the Spanish might seize the massive territory if given the opportunity. After this, Jefferson would face another challenge, gathering the funds to complete such an enormous transaction. Back in Washington, Jefferson and future President James Madison had to convince the Federalist Party to support the purchase of the massive territory, to which they remained reluctant. Negotiations would eventually lead to the United States purchasing the land for $11,250,000 from within the country's own treasury, with assumed debts paid for citizens of around $3,750,000. Combined with interest payments, the total total sum for the purchase resulted to $27,267,622, which, adjusted for inflation, would be a total of $340 million in today's currency. And it would be on October 21st, 1803, that the United States Senate gave Thomas Jefferson the authorization to make the purchase. It is with this that Thomas Jefferson began to make plans of not just expansion, but exploration. The purchased land consisted of the French Louisiana Territory, including the settled port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River drainage basin just west of the river itself. However, before the United States assumed ownership, only a small portion of territory was truly settled by the French. The rest was inhabited by the Native Americans. And in fact, the United States did not really purchase the territory from France. What in fact they actually purchased was the right of preeminence to the territory, meaning that only the U.S. was allowed to purchase land from the Native Americans already living within this territory. Purchases which would end up seeing the Native Americans exploited and driven off their own land for what was often outrageously undervalued prices. Yet it was in this world that the story of American paleontology would first begin. On May 14, 1804, just 1 year after the Louisiana Territory was purchased, Jefferson would send out an expedition team led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, what we now know today as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. The goal was to cross the Continental Divide and establish American-controlled settlements on the other side of the continent. However, while Thomas Jefferson was a man of politics, he was also a man of curiosity, particularly in science. One obsession of his was the study of strange bones that had been uncovered on the eastern side of the United States. In 1782, a large accumulation of bones were discovered in collapsed salt brine wells by a man named Arthur Campbell in what he referred to as the Salines, or what would eventually become the town of Saltville in southwest Virginia. These bones were sent to Jefferson at his home in Monticello, where he understood them as belonging to some species of elephantine animal. Back then, he would classify them as belonging to a mammoth, a word that, at this time, was taken from the Oxford English Dictionary, which itself originated from the Russian word mamont, which in the Mansi language means earthhorn, in reference to what would later be known to be woolly mammoth tusk in Siberia. More bones in particular, potentially from the same kind of animal, would be uncovered during Jefferson's own expedition to Big Bone Lick in Kentucky in 1798. However, Jefferson wasn't the only one obtaining such strange geological items, but other major figures in American history also took interest, such as Benjamin Franklin, Daniel Boone, 9th President of the United States William Henry Harrison, and even 1st President of the United States George Washington. These bones would later be understood to belong to the animal known today as the American mastodon, and Jefferson would become obsessed with finding them. The American mastodon is understood today to be a large megafaunal species of proboscidean. Proboscideans being the family of mammals that include elephants, mammoths, and all their closest extinct relatives. Mastodons were indigenous to vast portions of North America, ranging from as far north as Canada to even as far south as Central America. They were browsing giants, living alongside forested areas. Just like modern-day elephants, American mastodons also traveled in social groups consisting of females and young, while large male bulls were solitary until mating season. But during Jefferson's time, the bones of these animals uncovered in Big Bone Lick and Saltville remained mysterious in origin. There was also another mysterious creature that Thomas Jefferson studied. In 1796, whilst in a cave in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, Revolutionary War commander, author, and Virginian pioneer Colonel John Stuart would uncover fossil fragments of a femur and an ulnar radius, but perhaps most spectacular within this haul was a few foot bones that include 3 massive claws. In haste, Stuart would send his findings to Jefferson. Jefferson had once again in his collections another strange and forgotten creature to which which he would begin his observations. Jefferson would also go on to coin the name of the owner of the bones. Coming from ancient Greek, he would call it megalonyx, meaning great claw, in reference to the sheer size of the claw cores found amongst the rest of the bones. At the time, through comparisons between the fossil claws and modern lion claws, Jefferson would refer to megalonyx as a species of large lion, stating in his original paper's draft, "Let us only say then, what we may safely say, that he was more than 3 times as large as the lion." Thomas Jefferson would finalize his draft and present his observations within a publication titled "A Memoir on the Discovery of Certain Bones of a Quadruped of the Clawed Kind in the Western Parts of Virginia." The paper would be released in the year 1799 within a volume coinciding with another paper by Caspar Wistar, to which they also provided Jefferson with anatomical assistance on the bones and the illustrations of the specimens. Caspar also helped correct Jefferson's assignment of megalonyx as a species of extinct ground sloth instead of a large lion before the paper was to be published. Today, these 2 publications would be considered the first papers from North America to be devoted to paleontology, just 25 years before paleontology would be officially recognized as a field of science. In life, Megalonyx jeffersoni, with the specific name being in honor of Thomas Jefferson, was a type of giant ground sloth descended from an earlier ground sloth called Pliomentonastis that was native to North America. Megalonyx thrived in North America from the Pliocene to the late Pleistocene. It is also known to have had the widest distribution of any North American ground sloth, ranging from as far north as Alaska. M. jeffersoni is the most commonly identified species within the continent, and it is now designated as the state fossil of West Virginia, the home to where the first remains were uncovered. Animals like the American mastodon and Megalonyx were such unbelievable findings that Jefferson had to find more, but not just bones from caves and salt wells, for he intended to find living specimens that he believed were still out there, and he knew just who to rely on to find them. Not only was the Lewis and Clark expedition one to explore the North American continent, but Jefferson had entrusted them to also find living mastodons. Lewis and Clark's expedition would be harsh and perilous, traversing both the Missouri River and crossing the Rocky Mountains. They would struggle to keep the expedition going, and in order to survive, they had to rely on the hospitality of numerous Native American tribes. On September 23, 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition came to an end, with the group returning to the city of St. Louis. In between their journey and towards the end, the only remnants of the mastodon that they could return to Jefferson were more bones. No live mastodons have been seen or caught, leaving Jefferson and many scholars of his time with even more questions. Questions that scientists across the world were just starting to gain answers for. What happened to these giant creatures? It would later be realized in 1813 that the animals Jefferson had hoped to have found alive were victims of a newly proposed phenomenon. That year, French naturalist and zoologist Jean-Léopold Nicolas Frederick Baron Cuvier, otherwise known as George Cuvier, would write a publication called Essay on the Theory of the Earth. Cuvier was no stranger to the fossil upheaval within North America, and he himself studied fossils of various creatures. In fact, Cuvier would help describe the mastodon specimens within North America and even discover remnants of another giant ground sloth in Argentina, to which he would later describe as Megatherium. Cuvier had the same questions as most scholars studying fossils at the time, that being, where did these animals go? As the prevailing idea at the time was that animals could not disappear. Contrary to this established idea, Cuvier would become a promoter for catastrophism, the theory that the Earth was shaped by naturally occurring sudden and violent events, which ultimately led to the end of a given time frame or an epoch. Now, through Cuvier's essay, he proposed that the owners of many of the bones, both the mastodons or giant ground sloths, were now extinct due to a periodic catastrophic event, which to him would have been a flood. At the time, his theories underwent heavy scrutiny, controversy, and speculation. However, his works would continue to play a crucial role in many future publications, and his work would even lead him to believe that perhaps the Earth was much older than what was previously thought by millions or even billions of years. This this idea of faunal extinction would not stay in the old world forever, for it too reached across the ocean into North America. Thomas Jefferson at the time had an extreme collection of bones uncovered from Lewis and Clark's expedition, but that was simply it, only bones. Not once had the team sighted a living mastodon. It was clear that the animals had once existed, but they were no longer here, to which Jefferson in 1823 would make his realization fully known while writing to John Adams when he stated, "We see, too, evident proofs of the necessity of a superintending power to maintain the universe in its course and order. Certain races of animals are become extinct. Over time, many fossils would continue to turn up, one after another, some from large mammals, others being plant or fish fossils, but certain ones in particular would alter the very course of science. Fossils belonging to creatures that would spark the imagination of millions for centuries. Animals that were otherworldly compared to what was discovered before them and across the seas in Europe. And indeed, one of these peculiar fossils would flip everyone's knowledge on its head." William Buckland was a geologist from the University of Oxford. Buckland was well known for his works in understanding extinct animals. He had achieved a Copley Medal for proving that a cave in North Yorkshire, known as Kirkdale Cave, was once home to a species of extinct hyena. Buckland would soon gain more acknowledgement when he received the jawbone of an extraordinary animal. The jaw was rough in texture, it was fossilized, and it had a single tooth still embedded in the bone. At the time, Buckland had no idea what it belonged to, so in 1818, he asked for the assistance of George Cuvier, and after studying the bone, he came to the conclusion that the jaw belonged to a truly massive reptile. After this, Buckland and other scientists of the time would uncover even more fossils, all belonging to giant reptiles of a similar nature. Buckland would work together with fellow geologist William Conabert to help in a joint article called Cuvier's Ossements, to implement scientific names for giant reptile fossils discovered in the Netherlands. It would come to be known as Mosasaurus, and following this in the article, they later added in a new British reptile to which Conabert named Megalosaurus. However, in 1822, to Buckland and Conabert, Megalosaurus was envisioned to be a large quadrupedal reptile with a long, narrow snout. It was also estimated by Cuvier that the animal would have been around 40 feet long and weighing similar to a 7-foot tall elephant. This depiction would spark countless artworks depicting the animal, and even a life-size statue was created for it by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins for the Crystal Palace Park. However, for its discoverers, the paper for Megalosaurus would endure a rocky start. English surgeon James Parkinson would help announce the name Megalosaurus and provide illustrations of the jaw. Unfortunately, this joint article failed to be published due to Megalosaurus being initially regarded as a nomen nudum, or a naked name. It would take 2 more years before Buckland's continued work would see the light again, and on February 20th, 1824, at a meeting for the Geological Society of London, Megalosaurus was revealed to the public in the Transactions of the Geological Society. This publication marked the first non-avian dinosaur to be described, and marked the birth of the field of paleontology. In time, this newly formed scientific field of paleontology would reach farther than just the lands of Europe, and in fact would see discoveries all across the world, including North America and the United States as well. Eventually, American paleontologists would trek into the newly acquired lands of the American West and begin the hunt in earnest for these prehistoric fossil bones. Between the 1830s to the 1840s, pioneers on wagon trains would flood towards the very edge of the continuously forming United States, following the routes that Lewis and Clark had explored and beyond. The Oregon Trail was one of the most famous, a 2,000-mile route from Missouri to the state of Oregon. In 1843, almost 1,000 pioneers would utilize this trail, for many were in search of new homes and fresh starts, whereas for others, it was seen as an opportunity to strike it rich. 1849, at John Sutter's mill in Northern California, a man by the name of James Marshall would discover gold within the mill. This discovery would cause one of the most dramatic events in American history. News of the so-called California gold rush would spread across the continent, inspiring many prospective gold diggers to set up camps and settlements along the rocky outcrops of the state. By 1849, 80,000 people would arrive in California, and by 1854, there would be well over 300,000. Over $10 million worth in gold would be extracted in 1849 alone, and within the following year, it would increase dramatically to 41 million. As the years passed, the number of people would grow, so would the flow of gold extracted from the hills. The western side of the United States was, at the time, growing in population at an unprecedented rate, but such a rapid takeover would not go without tension. The fight against the natives for control of the land had already been occurring since the founding of the first colonies, but by the time the gold rush had begun, land claims would be settled in strong disputes, and unfortunately, in cases for Native Americans, these settlements often ended in extreme violence. In fact, the continuous expansion of the Europeans would see the Native Americans being continuously pushed from their historic homes, and the U.S. government expanding as states were formed and land was claimed. As ongoing tensions rose between the settlers and Native Americans, tensions would begin to rise for the United States in an entirely different conflict, one which would decide the fate of the entire nation. As Western states continued to be admitted into the Union, a major dispute would begin to arise between Northern and Southern states on whether or not the institution of slavery should be permitted to expand within these new territories. Since the country's colonial beginnings well before independence, slavery had been the primary force of production and labor. However, this would slowly begin to change during the early days of the Republic, with second President John Adams refusing to own slaves, and President Jefferson himself even outlawing the import of slaves in 1807. However, he himself was still a slave owner, and the practice of slavery in the United States was not relaxed. However, by the mid-1800s, with the invention of new technologies, the topic of slavery became a key issue in the country, with the more industrialized North becoming anti-slavery, while the more rural South, that still heavily relied on cash crops, would remain pro-slavery. This would eventually reach a boiling point in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln would be elected as the next president of the United States. Lincoln's electoral win would be the spark that would light the issue of slavery into something far more destructive, that being the American Civil War. On the outset of the war, many states would secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America, and on April 12, 1861, the first major battle to sound off the war would be that of Fort Sumter. Casualty rates from the war would vary as historical studies would advance into the modern day. Initially after the war, it was believed that around 620,000 had died. In 2024, the death toll of soldiers was recalculated at 698,000, but the death toll in total for the whole census was 1,030,000. One of the bloodiest moments in the history of America, the Civil War's last battle would be the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. However, it is still debated as to which battle was truly the last one fought in the war, due to communication limitations during the time. Some battles lingered long after the war had truly ended, but the war would functionally end with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox on April 9th. Though even with Lee's surrender, the bloodshed still was yet to end, as just 5 days later, President Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated in Ford's Theater. Devastated from the war, the former Confederacy would begin reconstruction and reintegration with the United States. The government would continue to help within the reintegration as the country would slowly but surely be stitched together. In the midst of this, the country would strengthen its policies through the Reconstruction Amendments, both outlawing slavery, guaranteeing former slave citizenship, and finally protecting their voting rights. The country, in its continued recovery, would also see a revolution in other forms as well. But instead of the surface, it would be once again found beneath the soil. Joseph Leidy, born on September 9, 1823, was one of the first of a new breed of scientists. He would initially study medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and would successfully graduate with a medical degree. However, his destiny would not be that of the medical sciences, but rather, his career would diverge as he was elected into the American Philosophical Society, a scholarly organization founded in 1743 by founding father Benjamin Franklin. The attitude of American scholarship was at times seen as distinguished, respectful, noble, an attitude descended from the European sciences. Just like many other fields within the sciences, the burgeoning field of paleontology itself would also become one of the many gentleman sciences. A gentleman scientist can be defined in manner as a scholar who is often financially independent and does not always need direct affiliation to a public institution, but their education can still be traced with their academic study. Joseph Leidy was one of the first of these so-called gentleman scientists from America, and many other American scholars would follow in his footsteps. And as it happens, paleontology would be the field of study to which Leidy would go on to take part in. However, while his discoveries would go on to help establish the ever-expanding field of paleontology in the US, it would be his contemporaries who would expand this field of science further than anyone else. Before the Civil War in 1858, a man by the name of William Parker Folk, descendant of Welsh Quakers, would visit John Estell Hopkins at a small tributary in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Hopkins had recently uncovered large bones within the area in 1838, and William Folk traveled to help dig the rest of the skeleton out. Folk would later contact Leidy. Together, they would gather a massive collection of fossils. Eventually, it was realized that the two had unearthed the very first nearly complete fossilized skeleton of a dinosaur. After careful studies of the bones, Folk and Leidy would momentarily name the animal Hadrosaurus folki in honor of William Folk. Unfortunately, the name wouldn't reach the scientific community until 1865 due to the outbreak of the Civil War, but when it did, it saw a spike in interest. Hadrosaurus itself was a genus of hadrosaurid ornithopod dinosaur that lived in North America during the Maastrichtian stage of the late Cretaceous. The holotype for the animal was discovered under a marine deposit, which means that the specimen in Leidy's possession died and was transported through a river, later being deposited in the ancient Cretaceous Sea. An animal like this ranged in size from 7 to 8 meters, or 23 to 26 feet. Like many hadrosaurs, Hadrosaurus itself is known to have a significantly robust build, a unique trait in many hadrosaurs. Eventually, with the help of the famous scientific illustrator Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, the man who constructed the dinosaur statues at Crystal Palace Park, Leidy and his crews would reconstruct a bipedal skeleton of Hadrosaurus at the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. This also marked Hadrosaurus to be the first ever mounted dinosaur skeleton. The discovery of Hadrosaurus was a momentous one that would kickstart a new age of American paleontology and spark a renewed interest and fascination of a lost world that was once ruled by dinosaurs. This grand accumulation of interest wasn't just for those who were part of the scientific community, but to many young dreamers as well. Americans whose ambitions would soar after the hardships of the Civil War, with the next generation focused on going to school and getting degrees in the sciences. And one of these young aspiring scholars would end up as one of Leidy's pupils. Joseph Leidy would become a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. The subject he taught would be comparative anatomy, a study that is one of the core educational tools when becoming a paleontologist. Within Leidy's class would arrive a young man by the name of Edward Drinker Cope. Born from a family of Quakers, he had long wished and begged to study at the university, finally being admitted in 1863. Cope would be an excellent example of that young generation who, after the war, wished to study, explore, and understand the world around them. Some, like Cope, would prefer the comfort of American soil, while others of the previous generation would prefer to study in Europe to truly enthrall themselves in the field of the gentleman's science. One such man was Othniel Charles Marsh. Born into a very high-income family, Marsh had the opportunity to study at Yale College, eventually traveling traveling further beyond the United States and becoming a student at many European institutions. He would research mineralogy, anatomy, and geology. Both Cope and Marsh, two examples of future scholars in a fully rebuilt United States, would explore many new worlds within science, each having a part to play in their respective academics. Each one would also play major roles within the history of American paleontology, eventually kickstarting the great dinosaur bone rush and what would shape up to be the greatest rivalry in the entire history of paleontology. What we now know today as the Bone Wars.